The following video may contain potential spoilers for these pieces of media, and is not intended for children under the age of 13. This video will be a full story analysis of Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil, the 2.5D platforming game released for the PlayStation 2 in 2001. The game was written by industry veteran Hideo Yoshizawa and Yoshihiko Araui. This analysis will be discussing the story of the game in full, and as such, will be spoiling the events of Klonoa 2 as well as Klonoa 1. If you've never played either of these games, I highly recommend playing both of them, be they the originals or the remastered versions, front to back, and then coming back to watch this video in order to get the most out of this analysis. Klonoa 2 is a game which requires a lot of inference on the part of the player, so much of what is discussed in this video will be my interpretation of the events, themes, and character motivations, while some of what is inferred may be considered non-canon or not intended by the original writers. I hope you find my interpretation and perspective on this game's deceptively intricate story to be one worth listening to. Klonoa 2 begins with Klonoa, after being tragically whisked away from what he thought was his lifelong home in Dortophantomile, unconsciously floating in a dreamy landscape as a ghostly figure calls out to him, begging Klonoa for his help. Klonoa then appears at sea in the dream world of Lunatea, where he is being scattered out by two shadowy figures. But just as he's about to be snatched up, Klonoa is saved by Lolo, a priestess in training who seeks the assistance of Klonoa in helping her ring the spirit bell, which will grant her the title of full priestess. Lolo is a shy yet kind and well-meaning girl who can also be particularly clumsy, as is humorously displayed throughout the rest of the game in various ways. There's also Lolo's friend Pupka, who is your average hot-headed comic relief character. These two characters instantly come off as charming and likable, and are inherently characters you just want to go on an adventure with. After ringing the spirit bell, the trio go visit Baguji, an enigmatic prophet, who explains that there are 4 other bells in each of the 4 kingdoms of Lunatea. However, a 5th bell belonging to none of the kingdoms is about to emerge and will wreak havoc and chaos once it appears. By ringing the bells in the 4 kingdoms and retrieving each of the bell's elements, they'll be able to prevent the 5th bell and its kingdom from emerging, and save the world from its chaos and catastrophe. With Lolo earning her title of full priestess, a lifelong dream of hers, as well as her ability to become one with Klonoa's magic ring, Klonoa, Lolo, and Pupka all set out to ring the bells and save the world. However, on their journey, they are met by Liarina and her sidekick Tat, sky pirates who wish to rob Klonoa of his treasured magic ring, the Wind Bullet. And that's pretty much the formula for the first 3 kingdoms. Each of the kingdoms has a specific theme attached to them. Everyone in the tranquil kingdom of La Lakusha, a serene mountaintop kingdom with heavenly, angelic statues, is at peace and spiritual. Everyone in Juliant, an amusement park kingdom where playtime never ends, is joyful and carefree. And everyone in the kingdom of Volk, a ragtag, war-torn city, is constantly fighting each other. They all, admittedly, make for some pretty unique stage aesthetics. But what's interesting about this is that all the kingdoms are completely isolated from one another. No one in any of the kingdoms ventures outside to see what the rest of the world offers, only choosing to bask in the emotions that their kingdom represents. The inhabitants of Lunatea all once moved freely throughout the land, but by the time Klonoa is summoned there, all of the kingdoms have been isolated for quite some time. Liarina initially sends her monsters out to defeat Klonoa in order to steal his ring, but later on we learn that Liarina is actually using the monsters she sends to siphon data from Klonoa's ring. The purpose of this, and why Liarina wants Klonoa's ring in the first place, is initially assumed to be simple greed. She's a sky pirate after all. Even Lolo describes Liarina and Tat as bandits who wreak havoc on the world while in pursuit of treasure. However, going through this much trouble just to get Klonoa's ring and then to pawn it off for some cash seems a little unlikely, especially since now she's deciding to siphon off the ring's data as well. Where everything starts to become a little more interesting is near the end of the Third Kingdom, Volk. After taking down Leorita's Vulcan tank, she reveals that the fight was, once again, used as a means to extract data from Klonoa's wind bullet. With that data, she reveals that she's used it to create an exact replica of Klonoa's ring and wield it as her own. However, instead of attacking Klonoa and using his own power against him, she does exactly what Klonoa and Lolo have been doing this entire time. She rings the bell and obtains the element. One would think she's doing this to prevent the trio's goal of saving the world, but Leorina ominously declares that she will become Lunatea's savior before disappearing in a cloud of fire and smoke. At this point in the story, there are some obvious questions looming in the air. Not just revolving Leorina, but also involving Lolo as well. Like, for example, why did Lolo need the power of the Dream Traveler to ring the spirit bells? It's stated that only those with enough spiritual power can make the spirit bells ring. If Lolo had that power prior to the events of the game, she would have rang the bells on her own without asking for Klonoa's help at all. Perhaps the logical explanation is that the spiritual power isn't coming from Lolo or her qualifications as a priestess, but instead coming pretty much from the sacred power of a being who can travel between dream worlds. Okay, so if Lolo was able to become a priestess by meeting some legendary otherworldly being, what about everyone else in Lunatea? How did they become priestesses? Later on, the game implies that everyone else had to go through a long and hard training process to earn their titles as priestesses. It's not really explained as to what that process is, but given all the information we have now, and will be getting later on, we can infer that becoming a priestess in Lunatea is taxing to say the least. That information is given to us in the Fourth Kingdom, the indecisive kingdom of Mira Mira. This kingdom is filled with people who never venture outside, instead preferring to stay inside their magic castle and observe the mirrors which reflect back to them images of their past. Now, given that their past seems to also just be staring at more mirrors, their existence is a bit paradoxical and confusing, which is appropriately implemented into this stage's level design. Nice touch, I must say. But as you go through Mira Mira, you may start to notice something if you stop and pay attention at certain points of the level, and that's this distant, mocking laughter of children playing in the background. Now, if the mirrors of this place show the viewer's past, it wouldn't make sense for Klonoa to be the source of this laughter, since nothing like that happened to him in Door to Phantomile. And sure enough, we learn the real reason Lolo sought out the help of the Dream Traveler. As it turns out, Lolo was mocked and bullied by her fellow priestesses in training. She was told that she would never amount to anything other than a failure over and over again, so much so that eventually she would end up believing them. She wouldn't be able to become a priestess because she was just simply too weak to do so. That is until she happens to hear of a prophecy from the village wiseman Bagaji that just might turn things around. For Lolo, Klonoa was a crutch, a shortcut to the instant gratification she needed, and the one cheat code she could use in order to show the people who tore her down that she wasn't what they all thought she was. But that doesn't change the fact that, all things considered, Lolo still cheated, and by the end of this level she begins to understand that, even when theoretically she got what she wanted, she still has to internally deal with the fact that despite having the title of priestess, she might not possess the strength a priestess should have. And she begins to realize that maybe she didn't save Klonoa from the Sea of Tears out of concern for a friend, but instead for her own selfish reasons. Lolo has been struggling with her imposter syndrome, these feelings of inadequacy that she has been bottling up since the game began. Lolo figures that if she keeps the task at hand at the forefront of her thoughts, then she would be able to overcome these feelings. But in reality, Lolo knew that she was simply running away, using her friend as a tool in the process. It isn't until she literally comes face to face with her insecurities, unable to run anymore, does she succumb to her sadness.
Share swim down. Such a leon.
Klonoa fails to find the words to comfort her and can only watch as his new friend weeps and apologizes to him. But since now the world is counting on them, they have no choice but to keep going. The trio continue in silence until they reach the fourth and final bell. The bell is guarded by a giant withered old tree who can also apparently talk. The tree asks them why they've taken it upon themselves to save the world, pointing out it senses Lolo is questioning if she's on this quest for the right reasons. The tree, eager to see their resolve to obtain the element, summons a giant bird for the trio to battle. While Klonoa is ready to fight, Lolo seems to admit defeat. She simply freezes, unable to find the will to do anything but watch Klonoa struggling to fight a monster without the powers he's been using for the entire adventure so far. She believes that a fraud isn't qualified to save the world. She's so distraught and guilty and sad over how she's cheated not only the system, but her friend Klonoa, that she lets her emotions completely take control and simply gives up. She's ignored her sadness completely throughout her journey, and when it all finally catches up to her, she becomes completely incapacitated, unable to do anything as her will to keep going is drowned out. Klonoa, however, keeps on fighting even without his wind bullet, which was powered by Lolo and has been used as our main form of attack throughout the entire game. Popka, as a result, gives Lolo the talking to that she probably doesn't deserve, but certainly needs. Popka quite plainly tells Lolo that she's being a stupid fool. That when it comes to saving the world and doing what's right, qualifications aren't what's important. The perfect example of this being Klonoa himself. Klonoa, an outsider to the world of Lunatea, really has no business or reason really to fight for this place. It isn't his home, and going by the events of Door to Phantomile, he knows he's destined to leave at some point. But Klonoa doesn't do it because he has any particular reason to, nor does he do it because he's fulfilled some sort of hero qualification checklist. He does it because he knows it's the right thing to do, and because his friends asked him to. Plain and simple. There's no noble quest to prove his worth at the core of his struggle, just the will to keep trying for this world he's a complete stranger to. And so, Lolo, being brought to her senses with the help of her friend, overcomes her insecurities and once again finds the will to keep going. This character moment, I feel, is what the core of Klonoa 2 is really all about. From the very beginning of the game, Lolo has always felt like she does during the start of this boss fight, always falling short of her peers, feeling weak and insignificant, eager to prove herself worthy to those around her, even as the people around her are the ones ridiculing her as a failure. But Lolo, being blinded by her sadness, develops a case of tunnel vision, eager to prove those people wrong, no matter the cost. She's more eager to prove it to the people who put her down, rather than she is eager to prove it to herself. Even if it means riding on the back of someone who is more capable than she is. The question as to whether or not this would even make her happy may have crossed her mind throughout the game, but she never comes to confront it, instead suppressing her emotions and simply focusing on the task at hand in an effort to quiet her sadness. That, in turn, makes it even harder for her when she realizes she can't hide from her pain anymore. As a result, she becomes consumed by those emotions and almost gives in to her insecurities entirely. Only when she acknowledges her sadness and accepts it as a part of herself is she able to heal, do what needs to be done, and grow as a person. This struggle is reflected in the world of Klonoa 2 as well. It's described earlier in the game that the four kingdoms of Lunatea are all tied to a specific emotion, joy, tranquility, indecision, and anger. But, like I described earlier, the four kingdoms are completely isolated from each other. Their inhabitants only care to feel one kind of emotion while ignoring all their other emotions. This singularity mindset, this act of forcing oneself to feel a specific way while ignoring all the other emotions which makes them who they are, is a theme that is reflected throughout Klonoa 2 in its world, in its protagonists, and as we come to find out, even its antagonists. After reclaiming the final element and returning to Bagaji, Klonoa and the gang work to try and find a way to get the other element Liarina stole from them back. Bagaji suggests that the elements be kept with him until they do so, but then it's revealed that Liarina has disguised herself as Bagaji to obtain the remaining elements, the heroes playing right into her hands. Liarina vows to make the world pay before disappearing off with the elements, her true intentions unknown. It's also worth noting that multiple times throughout the game, the mysterious voice which Klonoa heard at the beginning is still heard by Klonoa. The voice especially becomes more commonly heard near the end, always beckoning Klonoa for his help. Here though, it seems like the voice is actually parroting what Liarina is saying. It's unclear though what this means, and I can only assume it means that the voice has some sort of influence over Liarina in this scene, and perhaps after this scene as well. With no idea what to do next, the trio visit the High Priestess in Lalakusha once again. It's here that the High Priestess sheds some light on Liarina's past. She, herself, was once a young priestess in training in the kingdom of Lalakusha long ago. But one day she brashly abandons her training, calling it useless, and vows to find another way to obtain great power. Power enough to exceed that of the gods.
لطفاً سنتظم ساتناتو. Share fruit.
On a first playthrough, this scene comes off as kinda lame and a pretty weak motivation for Liarina allegedly becoming evil. It makes it look like it was simple impatience and maybe even boredom that caused her to become a ruthless sky pirate, which I think is pretty uninteresting. But, thankfully, Klonoa 2 is a game which rewards attentive players, or players who replay the game and rewatch the cutscenes to get the most out of the story. If you blink, you'll miss it, but you might have missed this little "I'll show them" section of this line right before Liarina quits her training. Who is this them she could possibly be referring to, and why would she want to become more powerful than them? It could be inferred that she's referring to the gods of Lunatea, since she also mentions she wants to be powerful enough to be noticed by them. However, considering how elitist and cruel Lolo's peers were and how much they tried to convince her that she was a failure, I'd say it's a reasonable assessment that Liarina experienced similar bullying and ridicule that Lolo faced. I think it's likely that she was put down, criticized, and ultimately deemed not worthy by the society she tried to become a part of. Liarina has internalized and suppressed that sadness in a similar way Lolo had as well, perhaps even more so. They even go about running away from their sadness in similar ways by ultimately going after the same goal, gaining the power of the Dream Traveler's Ring, collecting each of the kingdom's elements, and becoming the world's savior at any cost. They go about reaching that goal in different ways, but I think it's reasonable to say that they are going through the same pain, the same journey, the same sadness. At this point, it has become abundantly clear that Liarina has essentially adopted the thematic role as Lolo's shadow. Lolo and Liarina are essentially two sides of the same coin. Lolo's heart is in the right place, certainly more so than Liarina's is, but they both have the flaw of running away from their sorrow and insecurities rather than confronting them head-on. The only difference I can discern from the two is that Lolo, the shy and reserved girl she is, seems to be a little bit more aware of her sadness and aware as to what she's ultimately doing and why she's doing it. She's consciously running away, aware of her sadness, yet choosing to ignore it. She only begins to break down when she can't run away anymore, and has her past literally played back to her. Liarina, however, seems keen on completely ignoring her past altogether, leaving it behind and erasing all traces of its existence within her by adopting a completely different identity, eradicating the priestess in training Leo and becoming the sky pirate Liarina. She might not even be aware of how much she's truly hurting, as she suppressed so much of it in the pursuit of power and becoming the ultimate sky pirate. But perhaps as we go on with the story, there may just be even more going on here than we've discussed thus far. From the tower in Lalakusha, the group discovers that Liarina has used the elements to summon the infamous fifth bell. With the power of the bell, Liarina plans to summon the fifth kingdom and to consume the world with that kingdom's emotion, the kingdom of sorrow. Klonoa chases down Liarina and confronts her on board the Ishra's Ark, the vessel she's using to summon the fifth kingdom. As Liarina vows to show the world sorrow, it looks like we're finally about to get the epic showdown between Klonoa and Liarina that we've been expecting. However, what we get instead is probably one of the best moments in the entire game, and if not, then the entire series. Liarina is consumed by the so-called power of sorrow, and is transformed into an unrecognizable monster that Klonoa has to take down. Throughout Liarina's journey, she's been keen to abandon her past and the sadness which came along with it, to completely wipe away that identity and start anew. But while she may have cast aside that identity, the sadness of the old identity still lurks within her, and is the catalyst for everything she does, even though she doesn't realize it. The only reason she became a sky pirate and became so obsessed with that power is because of that pain, after all. In her pursuit to rid herself of her alternate identity, the part of herself she despises, she instead ends up becoming something wholly unrecognizable, and devoid of any identity at all. I know I haven't discussed gameplay much throughout this story-focused analysis, but I think this one time, it's worth bringing up how climactic and impactful this entire fight feels. Not only is it a multi-phase fight, which switches up the boss's attacks frequently, but it also features different ways in which you attack it. Not only that, but when the boss fight shifts phases, it lets out a painful shriek, no doubt coming from whatever is left of Liarina within it. It really feels like you're fighting an unpredictable creature, but it also feels like you're fighting someone who deep down needs someone to help them through their pain. Top that off with the single best track in the entire game, and what you get is one of the most memorable moments I think I've ever experienced in a platformer, 2D or otherwise. After defeating the creature, Liarina seems to return to normal, and has to come face to face with her situation. It's here Liarina realizes just how much she was running away from her sadness, and how even with the power she had obtained, it wasn't enough to heal the wounds she'd ignored for so long. She liked to believe she was putting the past behind her, when in reality, it was the pain of the past she never confronted, which ultimately led to her being controlled by the power of sorrow.
Let's touch down. Let's root for let's touch down.
She finally has her moment of release, and urges Klonoa and Lolo to put a stop to what she started. The Ark, which is connecting the Fifth Kingdom to the real world, has to be stopped, and Klonoa does just that by destroying all of its engines and crashing it back down into the Sea of Tears. However, the group still find themselves in the Kingdom of Sorrow, the work that the Ark started having been completed. Liarina tells them that the Ark merely opened the path, that they can still prevent the destruction of the world by defeating the ruler of the Fifth Kingdom, the King of Sorrow. What follows is another incredibly memorable level. The Kingdom of Sorrow stage is the most visually impactful the game has gotten up to at this point. Graphically, as a whole, Klonoa 2 looks about the quality of what you would expect from an early era PlayStation 2 game. It features a lot of looping animations for its cutscenes and some simple models and visual effects. Nothing that pushes the console to its limits in terms of raw power. Where Klonoa 2 shines, however, is in its style and art direction. And also its 60 frames per second, but mostly its style and art direction. Not just in the cel-shaded designs of the characters, but also the scope and scale of the levels. The tone and emotion each kingdom is meant to evoke are reflected very well all around. This all comes to a crescendo, though, in this penultimate stage. You start out by climbing this maze of interweaving architecture against a brilliantly setting sun, the journey coming to a melancholic end. The little touches throughout the environment also reinforce the feeling of isolation and loneliness. Fountains which flow no water, masks with smiles and frowns hanging from balconies, areas with knocked over furniture that have long since been abandoned, bottles and clocks and other trinkets that have been left behind, never to find a home again. As you climb up this structure, the environment, contrasted against the background, creates such an impactful sense of depth and emptiness, yet elegance and beauty in its composition, complexity and peacefulness. This is all complemented with the music, which becomes this echoed, disfigured piece that shifts between melodies and disorients just as much as it enraptures. In an appropriately dreamlike way, it jumps from idea to idea, creating a new experience while also being deeply rooted in the experiences we've had so far. If you pay close attention, parts of Lolo's theme and also Bagaji's theme can be heard later on in the song. Not only that, but we also get to hear Grandpa's theme and the Song of Rebirth from Klonoa 1 being worked into the composition as well, indicating that the memory of what happened in the events of Door to Phantomile are perhaps bubbling up inside Klonoa during this level. The lack of closure and the sadness of his past slowly drifting back to him. This level is also undeniably the longest in the entire game. A lot of Klonoa 2's late game levels tend to be on the longer side, perhaps even to a detrimental degree. But I think the Kingdom of Sorrow definitely earns its longer length. As a final trek through the cast's sadness, a melancholic and beautiful reflection of the journey thus far, it feels appropriate that the level is as long as it is, because I know I was so captured by the visuals and atmosphere of it all on my first playthrough that I didn't mind being in that world for as long as the game asked me to be. By the time the level ends and you're greeted with that final shot of Klonoa outside of the King of Sorrow's throne room, you get a feeling of meditative catharsis that is hard to describe and even harder to replicate. One more boarding level acts as the bridge between the Kingdom of Sorrow and the final boss. During this level, we can hear the same laughter which we heard back in the Maze of Memory stage, the laughter of the other priestesses mocking Lolo. It's unclear what this is supposed to mean, though, since Lolo has already come to terms with her insecurities and has confronted her sorrow. So why would she be hearing it now, continuing to move past it like she already has? At the same time, we are going through this level in order to confront the embodiment of sorrow itself, so I guess, in a way, it's meant to be representative of Lolo's determination. She's not running away anymore, now she and her friends are literally going to face sadness head-on. It's also during this level where everyone hears the dream voice calling out for help, and not just Klonoa. Mind you, this is the same voice that not only Klonoa heard at the very beginning of the game before appearing in Lunatea, but it is also the same voice Liarina seemed to be under the influence of earlier. With the journey to the throne room coming to a close, Klonoa and the gang are ready to meet the mysterious voice calling out for help. They finally meet the King of Sorrow, alone in his throne room, and ask him what his ultimate intentions were for making the Fifth Bell and the Fifth Kingdom appear in Lunatea. The King of Sorrow, however, insists that he didn't make the Fifth Bell appear, and that it was always there in the Sea of Tears. It was the other four kingdoms, the inhabitants of Lunatea, who were the ones that refused to see the bell. He explains that the people of Lunatea, so insistent on trying to forget any sorrow they may have had, created a so-called veil over their minds. The people of Lunatea, of course, also includes our protagonists. It's revealed here that the King of Sorrow has been orchestrating the events of the entire story this whole time. By summoning the Dream Traveler, he would ultimately set in motion a course of events that would force Lunatea to not only remember sorrow, but to ultimately be consumed by it, just like he himself has been. The prophet Bagaji, who was the one who told Lolo that the Dream Traveler would appear in the Sea of Tears, was actually a creation of the King of Sorrow the entire time. It also seems as if the King of Sorrow was manipulating or perhaps even mind-controlling Liarina later on in the story, as it's revealed the dream voice we've been hearing throughout the game is in fact the King of Sorrow. It's not exactly explained how this is possible, but Liarina does mention that she was being used by some kind of power, which is more than likely connected to the king. Perhaps the King of Sorrow is able to manipulate people who feel a deep sense of sorrow, or maybe the king offered Liarina some sort of power when in reality it was a trap in order for the king to gain influence over Liarina. I think it's more likely that this plot point is meant to be merely symbolic. Liarina was driven by the sadness of her past to shed her old identity and become a sky pirate in search of power, even when she wasn't consciously aware of that sorrow. Since the King of Sorrow is the embodiment of sadness, Liarina was literally and figuratively being controlled by sadness. With the return of the Fifth Kingdom at hand, and everything going according to the King of Sorrow's plan, Klonoa and the King clash in a boss fight which, to be quite frank, isn't really all that great. It's okay, but both phases of the fight are a little too short and a little too easy, making the final boss as a whole feel pretty anticlimactic. This is a story analysis rather than a gameplay analysis though, so perhaps I should save that for another day. After taking down the first phase of the boss, the anguish of the King of Sorrow begins to become a bit more clear. Since Lunatea refuses to accept their sadness, that means they also refuse to accept the King of Sorrow himself. He's been both symbolically and quite literally ostracized from the entirety of Lunatea, deemed unworthy and unnecessary by the rest of the world. Very similar indeed to the feeling of unworthiness that Lolo and Liarina must have felt. It's here where Liarina comes in and gives the King of Sorrow a piece of her mind. She calls him out on thinking he's the only one who is truly sad in Lunatea, and for being the one who isolated himself from the rest of the world when the world rejected sorrow, implying that the King of Sorrow is just as responsible for the veil as the rest of Lunatea is. Liarina postulates that the real world is about more than just sorrow or the lack of sorrow, but is instead about a vast array of emotions. It's about indecision, it's about discord, it's about joy, it's about tranquility. She lends Klonoa the power of the elements from the other kingdoms to show the King of Sorrow just that. I believe the main themes of Klonoa 2 can be the most effectively examined by analyzing the characters of Lolo, Liarina, and the King of Sorrow. Liarina and the King of Sorrow are essentially two opposites on a sort of sadness spectrum, if you will. On the one hand, we have Liarina, who experiences a deep sense of inferiority from her time as a priestess and becomes a sky pirate in an effort to completely erase her sadness, to shed her identity and to become someone who is independent of her past pain. Ultimately, even when she does obtain the power she wanted, she ends up losing control of herself. The pain of her past catches up to her like it was always going to, no matter how much she tried to run away. The King of Sorrow, on the other hand, doesn't run away from his emotions at all. He faces his pain of the world rejecting him, so much so to the point of letting that rejection define him, completely giving into his negative emotions. Instead of challenging those negative emotions, he isolates himself from the rest of the world, utterly consumed by his hopelessness. Lolo is the character whom we could place right in the middle of this spectrum. She goes through similar experiences to both Liarina and the King of Sorrow, and even experiences a little bit of both extremes. She attempts to push aside her negative emotions, her feelings of guilt, inferiority, and shame. Very similar to what Liarina went through, although to a less extreme degree. She isn't creating a completely new persona for herself to adopt, but is aware of her sadness and consciously chooses to hide it. But when it all becomes too much for her to ignore anymore, she becomes practically paralyzed by her sadness, unable to even help her friends in need. Much like how the King of Sorrow is being consumed by his being denied by the world, Lolo is consumed by her feelings of being unworthy. But thanks to the help of Lolo's friends, she's able to confront and overcome those feelings and find the will to keep going. While Liarina may initially seem like Lolo's shadow, especially from a character design and lore perspective, it's really the King of Sorrow who is the true antithesis to Liarina in this story. One tries to destroy their sorrow, the other one allows themselves to be consumed by it. Meanwhile, Lolo represents the balance of both of the extremes these two characters represent. To acknowledge our insecurity, sadness, and pain, but to simultaneously not let it define us. Hope coming from darkness, strength coming from pain, and joy coming from sorrow. Thematically, it also makes sense that both the King of Sorrow and Liarina adopt the role of antagonists in the story, while Lolo adopts the role of the protagonist. Her way of life and her struggle is the one this story is telling us is the most sensible path. The path of emotional balance, the path which leads to truly understanding oneself and their place in the world. With the dust settled and the King of Sorrow defeated, he begs one last time for Klonoa's help. Klonoa, realizing his purpose and why he was brought to Lunatea, fulfills the king's request. Klonoa rings the Bell of Sorrow, which allows the Kingdom of Sorrow to permanently form in the real world, thus lifting Lunatea's veil. With the King of Sorrow defeated, however, the world will not be consumed by the same sadness the king was consumed by. Klonoa assures the king that this time the world will not forget their sorrows, and that sadness will be accepted all throughout Lunatea. No one will run away from their sadness anymore. The king evaporates into light and fades away, his wish fulfilled and finally having found his place in the world. Klonoa, Lolo, and Pupka are then seen back outside of the Kingdom of Sorrow, which is now fully visible from the sea. Lolo reveals that Liarina has taken up the task of rebuilding the Kingdom of Sorrow to make it inhabitable for the people of Lunatea. It's unclear whether Liarina still plans on being a sky pirate after this, but I still think it's interesting that she chooses to do this. Previously, she abandoned the identity of priestess to become a sky pirate, but now that she realizes that adopting that identity was her way of running away, she adopts a new identity once again, this time one where she won't run away from her sadness. Lolo also reveals that she has decided to give up her title of priestess and to start her training anew. Now that she has the strength to endure her insecurities, she becomes ready to earn the title on her own merits alone. With Lunatea at peace and his purpose in the world fulfilled, Klonoa knows what's meant to happen now. He doesn't belong in Lunatea. He's the dream traveler after all. He's meant to drift from dream to dream, helping those who call out to him. Once he's fulfilled his role in that world, just like in Door to Phantomile, he must leave until he is needed again in another world. This means that Klonoa must, once again, say goodbye to his friends. After everything they've been through, though, Lolo is confident she's going to be okay. She's learned to not run away from her sadness, and that includes the sadness of having to bid farewell to her friend. She has learned that as long as we still have the strength to keep going in life, it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to cry. There's often been a critique in storytelling, especially in video games, where there's been a lack in variety when it comes to creating emotional, gut-punching moments. For a lot of games, even some of my favorites, it's often a major character death that ends up becoming the emotional highlight, the big moment that is meant to move most audiences. As much as I love the Life is Strange series, a lot of its most gut-wrenching moments tend to be related to character deaths. Even Klonoa 1 is a culprit of this, with Grandpa's death being one of the more emotional and memorable moments for most people. That's not to say these moments aren't well executed in their own right, nor is it to say that these are the only emotional moments present in these games. Just that as a whole, there are so many more ways to tell a story which can have an emotional impact without resorting to the death of a major character. And that's why, even to this day, I still find the ending of Klonoa 2 to be remarkably refreshing. It's an incredibly bittersweet moment, but also just as sweet and touching to see Klonoa and Lolo's friendship come to this crescendo. Throughout the whole of Klonoa 2, there are no major character deaths. Technically, you could count the King of Sorrow's death, but that isn't meant to be a big tear-jerking scene, at least I never got that impression anyway. Rather, it's the moments when characters confront their inner struggles and insecurities, and show strength and joy in the face of unfortunate circumstances that prove to be the most emotionally charged and memorable moments. It's also worth comparing this ending to the ending of Door to Phantomile, because I think it yet again serves Klonoa 2's narrative themes. Klonoa 1's big goodbye ending scene was much more visceral and desperate, Hupo reaching out towards Klonoa at the last minute, both of them struggling to fight destiny. All of it only for Hupo to see Klonoa fade into the sky after promising that they would always be together. A promise he always knew could never be fulfilled. It could be argued that Hupo, through the events of that game, was running away from his own sadness. The fact that eventually Klonoa will be forced to leave this world is pushed to the back of his mind in the name of stopping Ghadius. But Hupo, of course, knows that Klonoa will eventually learn the truth, and at the worst time for him to know, right before he's whisked away. If Hupo had built up the strength to tell Klonoa who he was and what he'd done to him, perhaps they would have left on less traumatizing terms. Here in Klonoa 2, though, there is no running away anymore. Everyone in this game has learned to face their sorrow head-on, and as a result, we have a goodbye scene that is no less heartbreaking, but certainly more fulfilling, cathartic, and ultimately happier than what Klonoa had to go through in the first game. Klonoa also makes the remark that as long as they remember the sadness of this moment, they will always be together. Something that I'm sure he feels just as much for Hupo as he does for Lolo. But of course, Klonoa has other dream worlds who need his help. So with a tear from his eye, Klonoa walks off alone, fading away into light and into a new adventure. The credits sequence shows the world of Lunatea after Klonoa's departure. Liarina continues rebuilding the Kingdom of Sorrow, but we also see the inhabitants of the Four Kingdoms once again interacting with each other. With the return of Sorrow into the world, Lunatea can once again appreciate and acknowledge their other emotions as well, and are able to live far more fulfilling lives. The world of Lunatea has finally found its balance, just as much as our protagonists have. It's a great sequence that I think wraps everything up quite nicely, and we get to see the smiling faces of our friends one last time before the journey comes to a close. Now I think it's time to take a step back and take a look at what makes Klonoa 2's story as a whole so successful, as well as discuss the areas where I feel like it falls short. First off, I think praise should be directed towards the voice acting in Klonoa 2. As I'm sure you can tell by now, the characters speak in a fictional language with subtitles being displayed for the player to read, much like the first game. It's easy for universes with fictional languages to come across as mumbly gibberish, especially when they cop out and just start throwing around words used in real languages for no good reason. The fictional language in the Klonoa games can sometimes come across as gibberish, but the performances from the voice actors still emote like they're speaking in any other real-world language. The way they adjust their tone and inflections when they're happy, sad, or even in pain adds to the believability. It's pretty impressive stuff. Given the fact that this is supposed to be a world that exists as a result of someone's dream, it makes sense for the series as a whole to go this route. Dreams can be hazy and difficult to describe, but can nevertheless be clear to those experiencing them in the moment, so it's interesting to have characters talk in a way where you could understand what emotion they were going through even if you had no subtitles. Aside from the voice work, I think to have this kind of story, a story where the moral is not to ignore your emotions, and to teach players that it's okay to cry is great, especially for the time it was released. Generally speaking, video games were still being marketed to young men and teenage boys at the time, especially on the PlayStation 2 in 2001. Most media aimed at that age demographic at the time were gearing up to be edgy, mature, and violent adventures, some with more depth than others, but I can certainly tell you that when I was growing up in the mid-2000s, there were no stories that dealt with this kind of subject matter in such an in-depth and honest way. Doing something as simple as allowing your main characters to cry is something that wasn't really featured in the cartoons and video games that I grew up with. And when they did cry, it was usually overtly over the top or meant as a gag. Like, in 2003, you weren't going to start seeing Jack from Jak 2 crying or being emotionally open with Daxter or anything. Nah, man, those games are all about edge and being badass, and badasses don't cry, that's only for the baby boys.
You get used to it.
With Klonoa 2, though, it tells us that it's okay and even critically important to just simply let yourself be sad sometimes, because processing emotions in a healthy way is a crucial part of being who we are as human beings. All of this years before shows like Steven Universe and movies like Inside Out came along to tell us similar things. And yes, I'm making the Inside Out comparison. You all knew it was coming. Let's not run away from it anymore. Inside Out is a very similar movie in terms of theming when compared to Klonoa 2, and that is undeniably a compliment, seeing as Inside Out is literally my favorite movie ever. For example, the emotions in Inside Out are meant to represent the emotions of Riley and her reactions to the events of her life. Since Lunatea is literally a world that someone dreamt up in the real world, it's easy to see that these kingdoms are meant to serve a very similar function as the emotions in Inside Out do thematically. In Inside Out, joy and sadness are ejected from Riley's emotional headquarters, and as such, she's unable to feel those emotions. She is unable to lead a fulfilling life, only able to feel anger, fear, or disgust towards the world around her. The inhabitants of Lunatea also reject any emotions they deem unnecessary, and choose only to live in their sectioned-off kingdoms that represent their preferred emotion. As a result, it leads to the people of this world being isolated from one another, unable to grow as they either relive bygone days, fight with one another, or procrastinate their lives away. Though I feel Inside Out has a more well-rounded selection of emotions to provide commentary on. Of course, Klonoa 2 and Inside Out all have elements that represent sadness, joy, and anger, or in Klonoa 2's case, discord. But Inside Out also adds fear and disgust, which I feel are a more cohesive and well-rounded collection of emotions to generally represent most people. Klonoa 2, on the other hand, decides on indecision and tranquility as its two additional emotions to represent with its kingdoms, which I feel aren't quite as universal or well-rounded as fear and disgust. Additionally, Klonoa and company tend to take note of how single-minded and ignorant to the outside world the people of each kingdom they visit are. Appropriately so, since these are people who have neglected every other emotion in their lives, save for the one that is associated with their respective kingdoms. The people of Lalakusha, the Kingdom of Tranquility, on the other hand, don't really seem to have anything wrong with them. The only resident of the kingdom we see is the High Priestess, and while she certainly seems tranquil, she has a sense of agency and awareness of the other kingdoms in Lunatea. The only other people we see from this kingdom are the other priestesses in Lolo's flashback, as well as Lolo herself. So while there is a sense of meanness and cruelty that can exist in this kingdom, it does little to reinforce that this kingdom is isolated from all the rest. Because of this, La Lakusha feels like an unintended outlier to the otherwise tightness to the symbolic nature of Lunatea, and how it serves the themes of the story in an in-depth way. And while yes, the story and its implications and themes are in-depth as to what they say about the characters and to what they say about the world, I feel like it skims a bit on a lot of the other details. Klonoa 2 is overall lacking a lot of explanations and information that I think would have benefited the story greatly. Not to the point where there are plot holes everywhere or anything, but enough to the point where there are a lot of things that have to be inferred or left to the player's imagination. A lot of this comes from details surrounding Liarina. At no point does the game directly state that Liarina endured the same kind of bullying that Lolo did while they trained as priestesses. But it's what made the most sense to me personally, as I think it serves the story in an effective way. But this is by no means what the writers originally intended. At least I can't be sure it's what they intended, since again, nowhere in the game is this explained. Without that little bit of context I've inferred myself, it just looks like Liarina became power-hungry and decided to become evil because her training was taking too long? Or maybe she just wanted to prove herself to the gods because the gods are powerful and she wants to be powerful just like them because she thinks she can be. I find these interpretations of the character to be much less satisfying than the one I initially described, but no interpretation is more or less canon than the other because of this lack of detail. Similarly, the game seems to imply that the King of Sorrow had some form of control over Liarina, but we never see how that ultimately happened, or in what way she's being controlled, or if she's even being controlled at all. The player is simply left to fill in the blanks themselves. But that's not to say a story which asks its audience to fill in the blanks can't be successful. Eco, another game for the PlayStation 2, released around the same time, and also my favorite game ever, also had a story which left a lot of things unexplained. By the end, leaving the player with perhaps more questions than answers. But nothing is lost without those details. In fact, I think if Eco ended up over-explaining itself, it probably would have ended up becoming a little bit less impactful. Klonoa 2, on the other hand, could only gain and become a better story from fleshing out the fantastic events and characters it already has. But that's not to say that Klonoa 2 is lacking in any sort of neat details. One detail during the credit sequence that I know I didn't pick up on my first time around was that it seemed like the King of Sorrow was reincarnated after his death. This could mean a multitude of things. That since Lunatea found a reason to face sorrow, the King of Sorrow has found a newfound place in this world again. He's able to be a part of Lunatea rather than an outcast. Another neat detail, which I found out from Twitter, literally as I was writing this script, was that Liarina's eyes in the beginning of the game are a flat color, lacking reflection. Just before her boss fight, her eyes become smaller, giving off a depraved, manic look. But after her boss fight, her eye gains a reflective touch, becoming more emotive and personal, reflecting her change in the story. As discussed earlier, Lolo and Liarina are meant to contrast with each other. They even each have their own little sidekick buddy characters. Lolo's being Popka and Liarina's being Tat. I haven't talked much about either of these characters, but as comedy sidekicks, they're both serviceable. Typical comic relief stuff that I think works well. But in serving with the idea that Lolo and Liarina contrast with each other, Popka and Tat contrast with each other nicely as well. Popka is a character who has a feisty and abrasive exterior. He's often impatient and quick to get angry. He also isn't afraid of telling his friends what's on his mind, whether they want him to or not. He may do so in a harsh way, but it's all underneath a deep sense of caring for his friends. He's the kind of guy who will give it to you straight, his own form of tough love. Meanwhile, Tat is literally a two-faced manipulator. She flirts with Klonoa, implying that she likes him and thinks he's cute, gestures which are followed up with attempts to lead him into traps and danger. We're meant to believe that these gestures are made with at least some degree of earnestness, but later on she drops the act entirely and just straight up tells Klonoa she never liked him at all because of how they fought Liarina throughout the story. Just like Popka cares for Lolo, Tat also has a deep sense of loyalty towards Liarina, her partner in crime. It would have been nice to see how Tat's partnership with Liarina came to be, and even more interesting to see how Lolo and Popka became such good friends. It would have been nice to have a bit more context for these relationships, and to understand why Popka and Tat care so much for their respective friends that they would follow them on their journeys. But again, Klonoa 2 leaves out these details that would have given the story just a bit more bite, and made the emotional moments even more impactful. I've been talking a lot about detail, but I think the biggest detail that Klonoa Works ultimately skipped out on the most was Klonoa himself. There's nothing really wrong with Klonoa's characterization in this game. As a protagonist, he's great, especially in terms of his updated design for this game. I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say right now that this is my favorite look for the character, bar none, and I'm glad it's the one used throughout the rest of the series up until the Wii remake. But Klonoa's place in the story itself is a little inconsequential when you look at the full picture. Klonoa 2 is a story that I feel mostly focuses around Lolo and Liarina. When it comes down to it, those two are the real stars of the show. All of the game's themes and major developments revolve around these two characters and their emotional struggles. When comparing Klonoa to them, I don't think he's really fleshed out in a super meaningful way, despite being the titular character and despite having plenty to flesh out from the first game. He does a lot of the doing in the story, certainly, and he develops a strong bond with his companions, but even Popka points out that his connection to the world and its drama is minuscule at best. Compare this to Klonoa's connection to the world in Door to Phantomile. Klonoa is meant to believe that he spent his whole life in Phantomile, and even has family and a lifelong friend there. Even if by the end it all turns out to be a lie, Klonoa feels more like he's the main character in Door to Phantomile, compared to Lunatea's Veil. We see him go through the struggles a typical hero would throughout a grand journey, and by the end, all of the friends he's made along the way are all there to help him during the game's final battle. Not just in the cutscenes, but in the gameplay too. Everyone is here, working together to take down the big bad final boss. I don't think I really got that same feeling with 1 as I did in 2 in this regard, because while Klonoa is certainly an important part of the story, and his coming to Lunatea is the entire catalyst for the conflict within the game, the struggles and journey of the story mostly revolve around Lolo and ultimately make her the main protagonist. In the scenes where Liarina is talking to Klonoa and hinting towards her master plan, it feels like she should be talking more to Lolo instead, since Lolo is the dramatic foil of Liarina. I feel like there should have been more scenes with Lolo and Liarina interacting with each other in general, given how much they contrast with one another. It may have also been interesting to see these two characters come to a moment of understanding towards one another, once they've both reached their emotional epiphanies. Any struggles Klonoa goes through in connection to the first game are once again implied due to the lack of detail. How exactly does Klonoa feel about the events of the first game? We never know, because it's never touched upon. Klonoa himself never mentions the events of Door to Phantomile, so it could possibly even be inferred that Klonoa's memories have been altered just like they were in Klonoa 1. Perhaps he doesn't remember the events of the first game at all? But at the same time, the little nuggets the game sprinkles throughout the journey, like the music in the Kingdom of Sorrow, and Klonoa claiming he already knew how to double jump from the first game, could lead one to believe that he does remember the events of Klonoa 1. I get that the intention was most likely to create a story that could have been enjoyed independent of the first game. But I think there's just as much potential room for development and growth from Klonoa in this game as there is from Lolo. Finding his own sense of closure from the events of the first game in the struggle that Lolo goes through would have been excellent to see. But most of that growth is left to the player's imagination, which is a tad disappointing, I think. It would have also been excellent to see more moments where Klonoa and Lolo develop that strong bond they share by the end. I think it's certainly believable that Klonoa and Lolo have become good friends throughout the events of the game. But when you take a step back and look at how much they really got to speak directly to each other, it actually turns out to be not all that much. They have fun little interactions here and there, but they never have a heart-to-heart or any sort of conversation that really defines their connection to each other and explains exactly why they're good friends. I know I just got done praising the ending goodbye scene earlier, but a small part of me wishes it was just a little bit more earned. Keep in mind, I'm not asking for shipping content or anything here, just something that reinforces their connection a little bit, you know? Klonoa doesn't even comfort Lolo during or after she breaks down at the end of the Maze of Memories level. He just looks sad, feels bad for her, defends her from the old tree a little bit, and that's it. After that, Liarina steals the remaining elements, and it's all down to the wire from there. No time for chatting, I guess. Maybe a small cutscene between these moments where Klonoa reassures Lolo that he never felt used or betrayed by her would have gone a long way here. Maybe Klonoa could comfort her, say that he's seen the strength and growth in Lolo, and reassures her that they're friends and that's all that matters. I mean, yeah, it probably would have been corny, or perhaps slowed down the pace of the storytelling, but I think having at least one sweet moment with Lolo would have really helped strengthen Klonoa's presence in this story overall. It would have deepened the friendship the two share, and I think it would make the ending scene even more potent than it already is. I don't know, I think it would have been neat. What I also think is neat is how Klonoa 2 subverts the player's expectations if a player has already completed Klonoa 1. From the ending of Klonoa 1 and into Klonoa 2, it's pretty much confirmed that Klonoa's role as the Dream Traveler means that he's a being that is summoned to a dream world in peril. He's meant to solve that world's grand conflict, and once he's fulfilled that purpose, he leaves to go find the next dream world that needs him, or summons him in this case. Savvy players may have even come to that conclusion by the end of the first game alone. In the first game, Klonoa is summoned by Hupo to stop Gaudius from drowning Phantomile in a void of nightmares. Klonoa is ultimately summoned by a hero who needs his help stopping a great evil. So a player who jumps straight into Klonoa 2 might be going from character to character, trying to figure out who was the one that summoned Klonoa to Lunatea. Is it Lolo, Liarina, maybe even Bagaji? But Klonoa 2 switches up the script at the end, when it's revealed that Klonoa was summoned to Lunatea by the antagonist of the story rather than another one of the protagonists. Instead of being the world's savior, he is unwittingly contributing to the world's destruction, which I think is neat to think about after it's all said and done. It's also neat that Klonoa saves the world while still ultimately fulfilling the purpose assigned to him by the King of Sorrow. He lifts Lunatea's veil, making it acknowledge its sorrow, but stops it from being consumed by its sorrow, something which the King of Sorrow was probably not expecting to happen when summoning the Dream Traveler to his world. I think that little switch-up is a neat thing that makes Klonoa 2 just that more special, even despite its other flaws. No matter which way you look at it though, there's no changing what Klonoa 2, Lunatea's Veil, is ultimately about. By setting up its characters to contrast each other and putting them through similar struggles and mindsets, Klonoa 2 is a story of balance. A story about facing the part of ourselves we try to look away from. A story of acknowledging the parts of ourselves we're not proud of, yet not letting them define who we are. It's surprisingly in-depth for a game which, on the surface, just looks like another good versus evil story in a colorful, juvenile dream world. A lack of detail and some ambiguous bits here and there aren't enough to hold back its quality. Because despite its initially simple and surface level stop the bad guy premise, Klonoa 2 makes the point that as long as we face our sorrow and are honest with ourselves, we can find light in spite of our darkness. You still get that surface level stop the bad guy story, but if you really spend the time examining every facet of it, you get something truly special. And when you get down to it, that kind of sums up Klonoa 2 as a whole. Not just in terms of story, but also in terms of the experience of playing it. Because Klonoa 2 is just as much what it is on its surface as it is beneath its surface. That surface being a fun 2.5D platforming game that is absolutely brimming with charm and whimsy. I may have spent this entire analysis going through just the story and its themes and its characters, but I didn't even talk about all the other surface level elements that makes playing through Klonoa 2 such a joy. I didn't even talk about how good the cel-shaded visuals applied to all of the characters are, even to this day. I didn't even talk about how you could press the L1 and L2 buttons during gameplay to make Klonoa do a variety of taunts. It's especially fun to strike a cool pose after defeating a boss, or just to make Klonoa say the same thing over and over again, while he's being shot out of a cannon just to pass the time. I didn't even talk about how goofy and fun all the Joliant levels were, appropriately so for amusement park levels. How you can throw enemies into the performer in this section, and he yells at you when you do. How Klonoa himself becomes a performer in this room and is applauded as a performer when the player solves a puzzle. I didn't even talk about my first time playing the board riding levels. I first played Klonoa 2 immediately after visiting an amusement park myself, so the part of the level where Klonoa falls down the waterfall was only enhanced by the fact that I still felt the momentum of the roller coasters I was riding earlier long after getting off them. The music coming to a crescendo here only made the spectacle even more impactful. I didn't even talk about the funny little moments like Lolo being afraid of ghosts, or Popka just casually stealing the board from Joliant, or Lolo accidentally slipping that she may have a crush on Klonoa, or Tat calling Klonoa a pervert. I didn't even talk about how in Volk you can see a building being blown up in the background and see the inhabitants of the building running out before it blows. If you stop there, you can even still hear them talking and bickering amongst each other. I didn't even talk about how one of the levels had a song that is sung by Klonoa in the game's goofy fictional language, only made better by the fact that the song is an absolute bop and one of the best songs in the game. Not only that, but the official release of the soundtrack has a karaoke instrumental of the song in case you want to sing along with it, on the off chance you happened to memorize the goofy fictional lyrics to it. I didn't even talk about how if you hold down certain shoulder buttons, you can get an alternate title screen sequence where Lolo or Pupka interrupt Klonoa and his iconic Wahoo! And I didn't get to talk about the fact that, on top of all of that, Klonoa 2 is still an excellent game to actually play beginning to end, in case you didn't know. Great level design, puzzle mechanics, controls, the whole shebang. Although I'm sure the 91 on Metacritic was enough to get that across. Years after experiencing it, Klonoa 2 is still a game filled with color and charm, and it's one of those games that instantly puts me in a good mood every time I sit down to play it. And it's still impressive that a game with such a melancholic and dark second half can also fill a player with that sense of wonder and joy. The tonal shift in this dream world doesn't feel out of place either, because I feel like it reflects the real world we live in quite well. That even in places of deep despair, chaos, and sorrow, there can also exist a place of laughter and optimism. And only by recognizing the former can we fully appreciate the latter. No matter how deep our sorrow, there will always be joy hidden somewhere within. This game strikes a brilliant type of balance that I feel very few games manage to achieve. There's simply not a lot of games quite like it. Balance and brilliance, such is the mark of an excellent sequel. Such is the mark of one of the best 2D platformers the genre has to offer. Such is the mark of Klonoa 2, Lunatea's Veil.